Not solar panels, Chloe. Except the sun. No, they're not solar panels, though.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give us a couple more minutes. I see some people still logging on. Be back with you shortly. So how is everyone feeling this Thursday? Let's see. Okay, I see quite a few of us here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and first say what a wonderful session we had on Tuesday, and it really set the stage for the conversation we're going to have today. I know many of us are trying to make that transition from what was a pretty complex set of issues that were discussed Tuesday to this current session where we're thinking about something called broadening participation. And I'm going to get into the definitions of all of these things in detail in a few minutes, but just to acknowledge where we were on Tuesday, I want to suggest one thing to you all. And that is usually the quantitatively trained individual will ask one really critical question. And that question really is about the alternative hypothesis. So within a counterfactual world, the question then becomes, if we were not seeking to dismantle these barriers to Black, Indigenous, Latinx liberation, then the alternative would be what, right? Perhaps those things would even be worse than they are now, those barriers. So I just wanted to put that out there because I didn't want people to leave that session Tuesday thinking that there was nothing for us to do. There's lots of work for us to do, and work that, while not totally undermining the institutions that support white supremacy and dominance and so forth, it definitely makes those spaces where we can survive and experience many different levels of survival. It's not a monolithic experience. say the least. So I wanted to put that out there because I thought it was important, because this next conversation we're going to have is about STEM in particular, and how do we move from those realities about Tuesday into some more concrete practices. And another thing that I heard within a lot of those breakout sessions, especially from our colleagues that are in the natural, biological, and engineering sciences, they were like, what am I going to do with this? And I think this session is designed to help answer that question, or at least provide you with some different perspectives that might allow you to answer that question. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and some slides. My hope is that we're going to take pauses throughout and have general discussion about what's been presented. And there are some questions in there. And so we'll have time to discuss. And then I'm going to hold about 20 minutes for us to have general discussion at the end. Okay. Let's see here. Where are we? So I've already set the stage here, and so I'm just going to move on into it. And do you all see my screen? I want a thumbs up. Is that okay? Because there we go. Okay. So the objectives. We're interested in three big things, right? Theory, then critical theory, and then broadening participation theory. And hopefully you all received from Javon the broadening participation NSF document that I co-authored with some colleagues after doing a pretty expansive review of NSF's funding portfolio in the broadening participation mechanism. So here we have the objectives, of course, to identify theory and theoretical frameworks, to become familiar with broadening participation theories, and by way NSF, because NSF, broadening participation is an invention of NSF in a way, and it is a cross-cutting funded opportunity, but also integral part of its mission that cuts across directorates and divisions, right? And some of you probably have already been funded via the broadening participation mechanism. Also, to consider ways to further STEM research with critical perspectives. And again, this gets at that question that many of you posed after Tuesday's session about what am I to do with this information with STEM? And then also to demonstrate the integration of critical perspectives throughout the scientific process. So not just thinking about theory, but then working it throughout each step of the research, which then becomes really the best way to make sure that we're getting the critical part of all of this, right? Because it's the critical part of all this that we believe would be most transformative. And some of this for a lot of you will be reviewed, okay? It is clear that we all know what theory is. So I don't want you to think that I do not know that you know. But we're just going to kind of set out some really general ideas. The first, theory ideas to be tested in research. And then when we get to theoretical framework, we're talking about actual theoretical structures and how they work within your research process. So for example, one of them would be theoretical triangulation. And so as a structure composed of theory, we would have multiple lenses through which to view a particular phenomena that we're interested in researching. So a theoretical structure kind of guides a scientific inquiry, but also informs multiple areas of theory simultaneously within one single study. Then, of course, there's critical theory. And I just pulled from a lot of what we heard on Tuesday. I mean, of course, I could have included this textbook definition, right, or my own definition, but there were some really powerful observations made on Tuesday. And one was that it centered the voiceless and their humanity. Oftentimes, showcasing what is not heard and what is not seen. It identifies power relations, so it doesn't act agnostic about how people arrive to their different opportunities and social statuses. And then it relates to the epistemology, ontology, and axiology. We went over those last week, and all three are instrumental to theory. And then also it sought realism. And I think it was here where Adrian Dixon had a very different idea, one of our panelists, about the potential of dismantling some of these barriers. And not to say that it's either you do or you don't. Again, I believe that there's some flexibility there in what our action brings about. Whether it dismantles and totally undermines the institutions that support white supremacy is one thing, but nonetheless, it does make space for us to live as full of a humanity as possible. But it seeks realism in the potential for social transformation. So I just thought these were some of the defining themes that came out of our conversation on Tuesday. And so I wanted to give you an example of the triangulated theoretical framework as a structure. And this one comes from my own research. The one that I had 3 grants that were funded by NSF to understand how social control intersects with intersectionality and status attainment mechanisms to really undermine persistence and access in STEM pipelines and professions. And so, you know, our theory or our big question for this study was, would we first need to drain that school to prison pipeline in order to fill the STEM pipeline? And because of that, social control being one of those criminological theories about how institutions seek order and conformity, and then in turn issue sanctions for rule and norm violations. That became central then as a broadening participation theory, because to the extent that we can push back on those social forces, then we might see more people actually persisting in STEM. So that was the overview. And yes, it's a triangulated theoretical framework because intersectionality gets to the race-gender intersection, and social control gets to the discipline that happens within school. And of course, status attainment is what people experience social mobility through educational institutions. And here, I should have done all this while I was talking, but I did not. So, moving on. This is how NSF defines broadening participation, right? It is, this is language taken directly from their website. And the reason why broadening participation is so important, and I know many of my STEM colleagues here already know that STEM is one of those areas of tremendous underrepresentation when it comes to Indigenous, Black, and Latinx populations, right? And women and disability as well. and probably some others. I could think of language as being another underrepresented area. But broadening participation then has become a theoretical space where we talk about the frameworks that should be used to correct that, to change the fact that STEM fields are dominated by white and Asian populations and dominated by men. So this is the theoretical space that NSF has defined for that kind of work that then would lead to funding. Okay, so I wanted to share with you an overview of what NSF has done in terms of broadening participation work, what it's funded, and then they impaneled a group, pretty big group right here, to actually look at the entire broadening participation portfolio and to see, what is broadening participation now that NSF has created this catch-all, this area of work, and then funded research to, I guess, build that out. The question then became, well, why don't we look at the research? Or if we look at the research, how then could broadening participation be defined? And so you received the brief that the group here authored, and there's more at this website. And yes, that's me. But I didn't put it there. It's on the website. So if you go to the website, and I think this little part up here, the http cadrek12.org, that's the actual URL. So you can go ahead and go there if you need to. But here you're going to find a lot of products about broadening participation in STEM. So these synthesis products, essentially we created a policy brief because we wanted to share what broadening participation should mean within practice and within policy, particularly K-12. But I could see it having relevance for higher education as well. But then we had the theory paper. The theory paper you received, and it provides guidance about using theory and research on broadening participation. It highlights some currently used theories and identifies opportunities for us to use different theories, different approaches. And so here are the theories that basically make up this corpus of work that NSF is funding. So I am not saying that if you use one of these, they will recognize it as broadening participation. We're going to talk a little bit about how you construct broadening participation theory in a minute. But the reason why these are broadening participation theories, not just because NSF funded them, they're broadening participation theories because they present an obstacle that, if corrected, should lead to greater participation of underrepresented groups in STEM. That's why they are broadening participation theories. Again, they speak to the particular experiences of those who are underrepresented and could propose remedies that would lead to greater representation for those groups. So that is why they are broadening participation. So it's quite literally what the concept means. It broadens the participation of those groups. So while you may see these theories as, just the theories that you work with, NSF sees them as meeting a need, because there is no way that the nation will meet its need for the STEM profession and STEM knowledge in the future without greater participation among those that are currently underserved in STEM. And again, at any time you all have questions, just, unmute and jump in here. But I think a lot of these everyone is familiar with, and we can talk about more of them as we go along. So, broadening participation theory is a theory of change. Now, I know some theories, such as some varieties of critical race theory, perhaps, would not suggest even a change is possible. It just depends on your epistemology, right? Because there's even great variation within critical race theory. But for BP theory, it suggests that a group of individuals would be in STEM if it were not for these particular experiences, this particular social force, this particular inequality, this particular history, ancestry, nativity, all of these things that give those with power reason and ability to exclude underrepresented individuals from STEM. So it's about change. A BP theory is about change. It's change in educational practices, institutional practices, communities of practice, the structures of opportunities to learn. It's about change in learning behaviors on the part of kids, because once those things change in terms of educational practices, we presume that kids then will be free, liberated to learn as they would otherwise. And then it's also about change in beliefs, about practices and about learning. So on both fronts, on the school front and on the learning front, and in the environments in which both take place, that will end up broadening the participation of traditionally underserved and underrepresented populations in STEM. Okay, that is the theory of change. And so what I've done, and what I always do here, is I read the one-pagers that everyone submitted, the research statements, to understand your theory, your theoretical background. And oftentimes it's not there, right? Because you're just kind of proposing in more general terms what it is that you do. And some of you, of course, your subject area expertise is actually in STEM. So some of the social science aspect of it is yet to be developed. But in there, we understand that there are a few things that are required. One is, of course, the theory of change, but then some of you are doing intervention-based work, meaning you are testing the change and you want to understand how to understand the experience that you're providing, either within an educational context or somewhere else. And so that's why a theory of change then becomes really important, because the intervention is really the catalyst for it. And we're going to talk a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings of intervention as well. So building BP STEM theory. So I want, especially my, the individuals, the colleagues we have here that are in, let's just say engineering, for example. You might have your subject area. What did I do? There we go. You might have your subject area knowledge, right? Your STEM knowledge. And that's important to learning. We all know that that's vital. And then there's this institutional capacity part about it, the fact that people learn within programs that have particular resources and so forth. And those two things are really important to learning. But alone, these two things are insufficient theoretical justifications for funding, because it's not broadening participation theory. You have to have that. Let me go back. I think I just went too far. There we go. You have to have that last part, that broadening participation. And so I'll give you an example, and this is a real example. I want to say between 2016 and 2018, I met with about 150 different teams of researchers. NSF would fly us all to one of the regions, and these teams would bring their ideas, and we talk about research methods, and they were either from HBCUs, MSIs, or TCUs. And so I'd read their one pagers. This is an exact representation of one of them. And this professor was like, I believe, we need to insert a step within the calculation of fractions in order to improve students' learning experiences. And because that was going to be done with a diverse sample, that somehow participation would be broadened. But I told him that would not get him funded, right? And so I worked with him, and not saying that this is the ideal way in terms of broadening participation theory, or the ideal example, because there are probably better examples out there. But this is what we came up with. I said, first, we understand the challenge, the barrier. Frustrated students experience perceived fraudulence and program attrition. Now, some of you may know that perceived fraudulence is the same thing as imposter syndrome, right? Because they were having a hard time with the calculation of the fractions. But once you inserted that one step that he mentioned, or this professor mentioned, greater experience, or I guess experiences with, or more experiences, or successful experiences, more successful experiences would lead to higher self-efficacy and positive math self-concept. Using a diverse sample, and then he would propose to assess self-efficacy and positive math self-concept after computation innovation for group treatment. That would broaden participation. And that was a fundable proposal. I keep going too far. There you go. That's a fundable proposal because that's broadening participation. It can't be just an innovation within the subject area space. It can't be just the addition of a new tool. It can't be just the addition of a new instrument. It has to be something that speaks to why they were underrepresented to begin with, that if addressed will broaden, will increase the odds for them relative to others. Okay, and I think that relative to others part is important because yes, we all know more resources are important. But the thinking about that is, if everyone has more resources, then we're just going to have the same inequality among a greater number of people. We need to get to those things that relatively disadvantages one group over others or from others. And so that's what broadening participation is about. And I'm seeing that there are some questions in the chat, and so I'm going to answer them real quick. Okay. Says, in terms of theoretical background of broadening participation, is the number more impact than the impact? I might have lost you on that. Okay, for example, the argument may be that there should be more physicists from underrepresented groups. Yes. If I take the position that supporting the growth and development of 50 physicists is a strong example, no. So again, yes, we need more physicists. The theory, though, is critical mass theory. See, so the increase in the number of physicists might be a goal, but what does that do to broaden participation? It might just give 50 physicists greater salaries. No, the thinking is that if we have 50, then they may have an exponential impact on graduate training. They may have an exponential impact, an impact that exceeds the benefits they had or the benefits they get from being physicists. It might transform institutions and programs. It might establish a new culture within communities of practice. Do you see what I mean? Those are the broadening participation theories.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but my point is still, if there are none, then 5 to me is broadening participation, because how do you measure both when you don't have something to measure with? And so when I use the example, in physicists of color from undergraduate pursuits, that's one of the mainstays and conversations that people are having. Why can't we get our students to go into that area, into that field of study? So how and when I'm writing a grant, I'm trying to demonstrate that my goal is to take students from undergraduate level and to bring them to the point where they want to go to graduate professional schools and become that STEM professional. And for me, that's the numbers. So when I'm dealing with the program managers, they're saying in your reports, we need to see numbers. How many students did you impact? How many faculty were trained? How much professional development did you do? How many hours? So I just need a real good view of that, because in my mind, and it's going to be hard for me to change the way I think in that area, is that I'm always looking at the numbers, because everything is driven by that in terms of change, in terms of statistical power, those types of things. So please give me some feedback.
Sure. So let me make sure I understand a few things. So when it comes to the program and its outputs, and we're going to talk about logic models and all of that in here. Yes, numbers are really important. Those are metrics to determine whether you're successful or not. So yes, that's important. But when we're talking about broadening participation, it's you as the researcher and as the practitioner might have different objectives, right? The practitioner, yes, is trying to mentor and so forth and get more physicists with degrees. The researcher in you, however, is documenting what was the challenge that those individuals doing their experience had, and then proposing to us a potential remedy that, if adopted, might impact more students than just the ones you're dealing with. It might be actually an innovation that could be evaluated, replicated, and then taken to scale so that it facilitates a broader NSF mission. So do you see how vitally important your work is? And we've always said this, the STEM innovation and capacity is actually at MSIs, HBCUs, and TCUs, because they have been producing more individuals with STEM backgrounds that move into graduate programs in the professions than the traditionally white institutions, the predominantly white institutions. Not more in terms of total number, but I think about 25% of STEM professionals have an HBCU degree. And that's a huge proportion, given that I would say about 8% of all students in college go to HBCUs or MSIs. Okay, so a huge outsized impact minoritized institutions are making. And so what we now need is not only for our scholars there to continue that work, but then also to say, this is what we see that actually works. that broadens, that makes sure that an individual will be successful here that might go elsewhere and not be successful. So is that a good answer? Does that, or is there something else I'm leaving out? Okay.
Yeah, that answered my question. And I'm seeing some of the responses in the chat, and I believe that I just, one of the responses I think from Dr. Felkner was 5 out of how many? I'm saying 5 new. So again, going from zero to 5, 0 to 10, not what we already have, but what we need to get. And so I appreciate you talking about the evaluation, replication, and bring it to the scale piece, because I think that's some of the language and some of the thought process that I need when I'm trying to justify why I need those funds to broaden participation of these students, on the undergraduate level, to push them to reach the place where they can be having the same conversation we're having now, because they now are in a position to really take it to the next level. So thank you.
And again, I think we have to continue that work too. That is absolutely essential. And it's the good work, the rewarding work. One of the key hopes and dreams, aspirations of broadening participation funding for NSF is that it will, and instead of letting those successful students leave with a degree and not their story, and not leave behind their story, right? We need their story before they leave with we need to know how they did it, what was done well, so that we can take that lessons learned and apply it elsewhere. And so knowing their challenge, knowing their story, and then how they've made sense of it and how it was hopefully addressed through some intervention or through some program is the hope of broadening participation. So, and Laita had a question. Laita, did you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think you've had a broadening participation grant. Laita, are you there? Yeah, I heard something. Are you?
Referring to later.
Laita. Okay, well, maybe she's having some technical difficulties. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here when you have a question, and I'll be happy to pause. But let's continue on here. There we go. So we talked about, I think I went backwards, but anyway, moving on to research hypotheses. So the theoretical framework should also inform the research questions and hypotheses, okay? And so, well, we haven't gotten to questions yet, but you definitely should have it inform the hypotheses you're making. And here you should know that a hypothesis, and of course, again, my apologies for assuming that you don't know these things when I know you do. But the hypothesis is the expected outcomes of research or the expected relationships between social factors given the theoretical framework or what is known. And then of course you have your tested hypotheses, that you have the null and alternative hypothesis. And they're also just hunches based on theory and even your researcher subjectivities, right? Because it's there where your anecdotal experience is like, that might be worth exploring. I noticed this. And then you launch on something that is systematically and scientifically structured to answer the question. And so I wanted to show you this once again, this triangulated theoretical framework. And the reason why I'm showing you this again is because this should map on to your hypothesis. And I'm going to show you the hypothesis that was related to that research grant. This is as specified within the grant proposal. And it says the order, conformity, and obedience seeking strategies to which race, gender groups are disproportionately exposed are related to lower levels of qualities that we know are supportive of success in engineering, including engagement, agency and learning, self-efficacy, and creativity and interpersonal confidence. I also add here collaborative learning. So how is the triangulation included? Well, here is the social control aspect of it. Here's the intersectionality aspect of it. And then here's the status attainment. So even in your hypothesis, you should have the theoretical structure. If it's a triangulated structure, it should be there. You should be taking your theory from inception throughout all components of your research. And I want to preface this or I want to put a little asterisk by this. We're not just talking about proposal writing. This should also be within your research, right? This is not only about an NSF proposal. This is about how you align your theory and theoretical frameworks and how they should carry throughout your research project. Okay, so then your research questions in theory. So next you have your research questions. They should follow from the theoretical void or gap that your theoretical framework has identified, or your triangulation. So not only proposals, but research should identify the knowledge gaps and propose questions that, when answered, would generate knowledge. There usually are primary research questions and there are secondary research questions. And, you know, just if we are talking about proposals, which we will be at some point, having an in-person meeting only about proposals, you should avoid numerous primary questions and so forth. And we'll get to that more later on. So the goals of theory in questions. In this case, some of you may know, most of you may know that the two criteria for broadening participation proposals, and really the two that cut across all opportunities within NSF, is intellectual merit and broader impacts. Intellectual merit, and in this case I've put critical, because I think, you know, when I read the intellectual merit criteria of NSF, it almost sounds, it aligns well with criticality. I'll just put it that way. Even though we have a different view of NSF and its panel review system, when you think about the words that it uses, it says paradigm shifting. It says transformative, and these are things that I think pique our interest just because many of us are interested in social transformation, right? We imagine a new set of circumstances, a new world. And this is something that at least a framework or a heuristic that NSF provides, in which we can kind of think about what research would need to be in order to achieve that paradigmatic change and that transformation. So theorizing interventions for change. Now here, it is also driven by theory, but I want to suggest first that we understand two competing realities about interventions. One is that oftentimes what people are proposing when they say intervention is actually development. So be careful here. A new program usually is not an intervention. You have to fight to make it an intervention. So for all of you who are interested in HBCU Up, which is a funding mechanism within NSF and so forth, yes, development is great there. But if you're going to go to EHR Core or EEC, Education Engineering Centers, or even SBE, Social Behavioral and Economic Directorate of NSF, your intervention is going to have to be what's on this right side of the screen. It's about behavioral change. It implies research. Yes, evaluation science or experimentation. And then foundation, early, late stage research, and impact studies. Okay, and that's not to say that formative and process studies wouldn't be of interest too, but there needs to be an intervention. And so how do you know that you have an intervention? And here we get to more theory. So you know you have an intervention by using the theory of first understanding the theory of manipulative causation, and then checking off some of these secondary concerns. One is that observing cause and effect relationships requires manipulation of the cause. If you cannot manipulate, if you can't manipulate it, it's not an intervention. Now, I think this is really an interesting point when we think about critical research about race. And I often tell people, you know, you will never be able to say that race is causal. Ethnicity cannot be causal because you cannot manipulate it. If you cannot manipulate it, it is never causal. We will never be able to prove that race causes anything through science. And when people hear that, they're like, oh, you know, and you know, we always get into these intense discussions about, well, what if you do this about race? And what if you do this about race? And yeah, but you can't change someone's race and then observe natural characteristics that are inherent to them. That's not possible. So there are limits to what we can know about race, and limits in suggesting that it causes anything. So here are some of the conditions. Can it be manipulated? Can you define what causes the change? Can you control the manipulation? Can the manipulation be reproduced? Are the manipulation and the change observable and measurable? Does it have a credible theory of change? These are some of the conditions that you should satisfy. Now, maybe not all of them, but these are often the conditions that you must satisfy in order to, I guess, confirm that you have an intervention. And I have some examples here. Example one. You propose to implement a PD workshop for STEM faculty on the topics of stereotype, threat, and implicit bias to assess changes in attitudes and inclusive pedagogy. Can it be manipulated? Yes. Well, first, can it be defined? I should have put that in there. It's a PD, right? So yes, it can be defined, it can be manipulated, it can be changed. So yes, you can control the manipulation. Can you reproduce it? Yes, you can take that manipulation and use it with a different set of faculty members. Are the manipulation and the change observable? Yes. And does it have a credible theory of change? Yes. So I put the little green check mark here to say, yes, this is an intervention. But this one isn't. This one proposes to implement a scholarship for women of color to assess critical mass theory effects on persistence in life STEM. And I'd like to hear from you all to tell me why isn't this one an intervention? Any thoughts?
Is it
Okay.
because you can't change gender?
Well, first, so gender isn't to be manipulated in this case. It's not what the intervention is.
You can't,
So-
as you pointed out, you can't manipulate race, and so women of color, the color cannot be manipulated. You can't change their race. So
Well, yeah, so they are just the group that's to experience the intervention. So it's not proposing to change race or gender. So the intervention here is the scholarship.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering, is the issue that you can't draw a direct connection between what they're trying to, what they think the scholarship will do in terms of persistence?
I think that's a good one too. Because the question I always ask when I hear this is, well, what is a scholarship? Are we talking about money? I mean, literally, is it? So yeah, money will get people into college, and it might actually help them persist. But if we were to give money to everyone, right, then it doesn't address the relative difference. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? It's a resource does not get to the more, let's say, even if we gave them the money to come to those schools or to those programs, will those programs be, will they do well enough to even keep them, right? Nothing changes about the experiences that actually have led to underrepresentation, even when students are well resourced.
So it doesn't seem like this has a credible theory of change.
So now, if the scholarship is a scholarship program, meaning there are things in it, like let's say internships or mentorship, then yes, it then becomes an intervention, but the intervention must be defined as the mentorship or the internship. It can't be defined as the scholarship. Because you can manipulate, internship and mentorship. You can't manipulate scholarship. That would mean that you'd have to take some people's money away. And that's not a good way. That's not a good manipulation at all. That actually might be unethical, right? So just be careful how you define what it is. And if it fails one of these things over here, then you probably need to rethink what your intervention is. Okay, there are lots of comments in the chat. Yeah, and money does not equal critical mass theory. There's, and again, there are lots of kids that come from well-to-do backgrounds that are not advancing in STEM. It is not just a money thing. There has to be something else that happens. And in this case, if you say that they get mentorship or they get an internship, then perhaps that's that new value added that changes the dynamic, the relative difference.
Hey, Otis, I wanted to share something around that whole same concept. So I just became a co-PI on an STEM grant. And when they first submit, Morgan has submitted a grant and it failed. One, it didn't have a research component and it didn't have an intervention. And it was primarily people in the STEM disciplines who had created this. It was a great program. It was a scholarship, but they kept saying there's no theory of change. And I was like, yeah, this is just, you think that your theory of change is you give people money and they persist. And so when we changed it and we used it, we framed it around kind of Tinto retention theory for STEM majors. We adapted some of his constructs around academic and social integration and some other programmatic kinds of things. I don't think it did rise to the level of an intervention at some point, because I kept pushing the team to think about what do you think is the thing that we're manipulating that will actually get them to persist. And it took the STEM people a little time to get there, because they were like, well, we're giving them money. And I'm like, that's not it. And so once I joined the team and really started to help them think that through and really build out an intervention grounded in a theoretical framework, we actually got the grant. And I kept telling them, as a social scientist, it's like, you know, you gotta, if you're a scientist and you're not partnering with a social scientist, particularly if you're going after certain things that are requiring behavioral shifts or persistence things, you'll be limited by how you see it. They just didn't see the world the same way. They were like, well, we're giving them money and, you know, we're doing these things, but there was no real consistent theory of change that was underpinning what they were doing. They were doing some great things, but the reviewers made a comment, well, y'all don't have any theory. There's no theory of change. There's just money and some activities. There's no way to link those things. And so I came in and helped them shore that up, and then actually add a research component to this STEM project. And it ultimately got funded. And again, it was other work there, not just because I came in, but I think that was the piece that brought everything together that they were trying to do, and brought you know, thinking about it from a theoretical perspective, that's what links all the activities to say all of these things, the mentoring, the experiences we're giving them, all of these things incorporate a change, and they had to justify that. So I strongly encourage people, particularly STEM folks who do bench science, if you're doing something where you're trying to kind of warrant persistence outcomes, you need a good, strong theory of change. If not, the reviewers are going to cut it down, even if it's a good idea, because they're going to be like, what makes you think doing this is going to get this outcome? So,
and Ronnie, I couldn't have said it better. Thank you for just putting it all together, framing it so nicely. The other thing that is really key here is that we need to learn about even the challenge, right? We really need that knowledge. So even if it is about resources and poverty, we need to know about how that is connected to a lot of the problems and systemic injustices and systemic ways in which people are underserved and groups are, given their background. That knowledge needs to be put forward. So yes, it is all about what Ronnie just mentioned, but the other thing that is vitally needed is that knowledge about what is happening for our kids and our youth and our future generations that we need to know about in order to mitigate. So yes, that's definitely wonderful. And so common considerations of interventions. We've talked about some of these. But these are things that you might think about as you draft your intervention, as you think it through about what is it that I believe will change the outcomes and change the landscape, change the resources or the environment to generate greater persistence. And so these are things that you should mention. Now, I said that we were going to talk about logic model. We are getting close to 15 minutes till, and I promised you actually 20 minutes of discussion. So I'm sorry we've gone over a little bit, but this is a theoretical, a visual representation of theory. One is, and I have this here. So, and by the way, everyone, these slides will be uploaded to your portal. So you're going to have these to refer back to. But this is a logic model, but another one that tends to be less utilized is the program theory. And here it is an example because it demonstrates the system of relationships, right? The what relates to what, not just like in the logic model, this tabular display of inputs, outputs, and expected outcomes. This tells you what relates to what causes what, how do we get from, how in the most ideal case will this intervention work? And that's called the program theory. So assessing interventions, program theory, asking a series of questions. Are the intervention goals and objectives well defined? Are the intervention goals and objectives feasible? Is the change process presumed in the program theory plausible? Are procedures for identifying target population, delivery of services, and sustaining them defined and sufficient? Are the intervention features well defined and sufficient? Are the intervention program resources adequate? Staffing, training, equipment, site intervention, and so forth. Can a baseline be established? So again, and the reason why we're going deep dive into intervention is because there's a lot of theory behind the theory of change. Your intervention is critical to the theory of change. Okay, and then last, we know that theory should guide the selection of the methods, guide the analytical decisions, and support critical inferences. These are the last 3 steps of the research process. And the example here, and this is example 2, it should be example 1, I switched them. Let's say that you are interested in critical race theory, and in this case, critical race analysis. And I've put here what critical, how this critical theoretical perspective maps on to a question about how can we model, demonstrate white and institutional racism in STEM. And I've decided to share this with you. This is going to be from a forthcoming article. And here what you have are marginal estimates of interaction terms. And so you have math test scores by percent white enrollment for suspended and non-suspended students. In this case, this is the Black sample. And as you can see, as the percentage of white enrollment is actually pretty low, the math test scores of African Americans is actually statistically no different than those individuals that were not suspended, right? But as the percentage of white enrollment increases, you actually see a pretty big decline in math test scores. And so I was like, what is going on here? What is going on here? You know? And so then I modeled self-efficacy because I was thinking, well, maybe it has something to do with their beliefs about math. And I was shocked to see basically the same pattern, but that in predominantly Black schools, the math self-efficacy score is pretty solid. So this decline that you see in the actual math test performance on the left has nothing to do with their beliefs about, well, at least it doesn't come from a belief that they can't do math, right? It comes from something else that's happening within predominantly white schools. And so we can theorize about that. You know, what is this? What's happening? But the reason why this is critical work in a way is because it's asking the critical question. Instead of thinking about Black deficit modeling of, you know, racial segregation within schools, how does that relate to the underperformance of African Americans? In this case, we're actually saying, well, what's happening with Black kids as the percentage of white kids within their schools increases? And that then changes the whole conversation. And now we're talking about heterogeneity effects and threshold effects, as opposed to thinking only about what's happening in majority minoritized contexts. Then I just wanted to make sure that this wasn't a product of selection, you know, unequal selection into schools. So I went ahead and did a machine learning estimated propensity score matching using inverse probability treatment weights into majority white versus non-white schools. And same outcomes, and I found basically the same thing. So these effects are actually happening even when we correct for the unequal probabilities of selection into schools of a racial composition. So in this case, you know, we're really thinking theoretically about centering Black experiences within white contexts. That's critical. We're also using a pretty critical approach in terms of methods because we are ruling out these counterfactual or alternative hypotheses to make sure we can be more secure in our inference. But then there was the other example that I wanted to share with you, and I don't know where it went. Hold on real quick. Should have been in here. Yeah, it's not in here. There was the other example was intersectionality, and I wanted to share that one with you, but it might be good that we stop here. I'll make sure the intersectionality example is included within the uploaded slides. But even then, intersectionality, theoretical premise, but should also be carried throughout the work. And so when you get to the methods and the analysis, you have some decisions to make. Do you go disaggregation according to race, gender? Which I generally say no, don't do it that way because then you're going to sacrifice power. But then you can also do structural equation modeling or path analysis to get at some of those intersectionalities. And then another would be interaction term. And so you have all these different ways that you can approach intersectionality. But it is something, again, that should be at the forefront in your theory, but then carry forward all the way through to your analysis and the inferences that you make. Okay, so I'll stop there and let's just have a general discussion about any of these thoughts, any questions that you have. And there are some in the chat. Let's see. I don't see. Okay. Any additional questions? Thoughts, comments?
Otis, I have so many questions. I don't have a question. You know how you have so many questions that you don't have a question? But I'm gonna think on a lot. First of all, the results you saw when you that last slide with the Black students in the white context, their self-efficacy was consistent, but so my question to you is what theoretical perspective were you coming from to even know to run that analysis and to kind of think about it the way you did? I'm curious.
Well, the first thing I was thinking about is heterogeneity effects. And so my question was, you know, I see all of these concentrated poverty, concentrated, you know, segregation, and how that impacts students in mathematics. I see that quite a bit. And we're not really talking about all of those families that are actually trying to send their kids to schools in order to get algebra in middle school, you know, because we know that math resources, math teachers, access to algebra is more scarce in urban schools and high poverty schools. So we then see families deciding, well, I'm going to send my child to this school over here because they have the resource, but there's an assumption there, and really, I don't want to call it a naivete, but there's an assumption there that you sending your kid there that you're going to actually get that resource, right? And that it's going to be a beneficial context for them. So when you think about white racism, systemic racism, structural racism, you start to think about these questions of how will kids experience white context? So that's the theoretical premise that I'm coming from, that I'm interested in structural and systemic racism in this case, and how it impacts access to math and likelihood of testing well, and of course your beliefs. And I included the beliefs part because I didn't want people to say, well, that's just because Black people don't believe that math is for them. You hear that a lot. And so I wanted to discount that as well, that actually these kids actually have high self-efficacy scores in mathematics. So their slide decline is not due to any corresponding decline in beliefs.
That is fascinating because I have a graduate student who's looking at a similar thing. She works in an elite high school in Baltimore where it's predominantly Black, but when you get through, she teaches the AP calculus. So she sees a diminishment of Black students throughout the math trajectory. So you got predominantly Black students in your algebra, but by the time you get to AP Calc, it's all white. And the few, and I think it's like a 12% white population, but in AP Calculus, it literally is 80%. And so she did some qualitative study of the experiences of the Black students in the AP Calculus course. Fascinating. Now, again, it was qualitative as a small thing, but it's interesting how you quantify some of the things that she actually saw. Where these kids were all selected. This is a high selective school. Everybody had to meet certain criteria to get in. But when you looked at, they had IB and AP, white, 80%. It just shifted. And so she was like, how did that happen? And the faculty, which is interesting, it's a predominant, Baltimore City is predominantly African-American, but the math department is predominantly white. She's the only Black instructor in the math department. So it was just interesting. So she's trying to come up with her dissertation like, Dr. E, something's going on here. So it's just interesting how you took something we were trying to conceptualize qualitatively to get at these students' experience. And some of the things you saw quantitatively was some of the things that they talked about. They believed they could do it. They had high ability. But when they were in these white contexts, they were marginalized by these white teachers, even though they had the same ability as the white students in there. And they would constantly be shoveled out of the math pipeline. So by the time you get to AP Calculus, you had maybe 3 or 4 Black students and 20 white students.
You know, Laura just said something really important too. I actually do cite opportunity hoarding within the work, and also white parents' demands for stratification within diverse contexts. And that's been known for a long time, that when schools become more heterogeneous, well-to-do families actually demand stratification. They want differentiated tracks and greater opportunities for their students to excel, or in this case, escape mediocrity is the way that some of them think about it. But really it is also no different than opportunity hoarding, because they want stratification for their kids. They don't want, right? They want these different tracks so that their kids can be in that top track. They don't want it so there can be equal access to those tracks.
Wow, I have a whole lot of questions, but that was my only one. I'm not going to I'm not going to opportunity hoard this conversation, but it's just fascinating as a math educator, and just have seen some of the things. I have friends who have their kids in these friend schools and all these places. They spending thousands of dollars to take, and their kids are coming out there going to Morgan in remedial math. And I find that fascinating. Like, what you just spent $20,000 a year to have your kid go to McDonough, and now she's in my development. Like, how is that even possible? Well, you got to consider the context. And most of my friends, they don't listen to me. They just be like, well, Ronnie, you're just too Black. I'm like, no, it's not that. I'm telling you, you're making a whole lot of assumptions.
We are. But you know, Faye is actually asking something that's kind of along those lines. And she was like, Otis, is that irrespective of race and ethnicity? And so, Yeah, I did run the whole sample and also the white sample. And the white sample is so interesting that within majority white context, well, first of all, on both test scores and beliefs, white suspended students tend to, at no time, equal or exceed the beliefs or math test scores of those that were not suspended. It's only for the Black sample where you actually see that the penalties for being suspended really aren't impacting the average math performance for their minoritized group, right? It's so in those Black contexts, if you're suspended, you know, it's not like it's the end of the world for you, right? You will still have, on average, the same performance as those that were not suspended. For white students, that was not the case at any percentage of white enrollment. It was much less for those that were suspended. I think we have some estimates for Latinx, but I can't recall what they are right off. But I think the same was true for the pooled analysis, that it pretty much mirrored what we found for the white population.
Wow, that just hurt my whole soul right there, but okay.
Well, I mean, there are some I think some really important critical points to be made here, right? That Black contexts have been thought of in the deficit for so long. And now we see that actually when it comes to notions of justice, they don't believe that discipline means that you are ineducable, right? They don't believe that even if and I say perceived bad behavior, but let's just say it might be real bad behavior. Even if it's real bad behavior, it doesn't disqualify you from needing to learn, right? From the resource that's important to your learning. So I think there's actually some really good things to be said of the work, but it also suggests that the resource inequality that we see across schools according to race, because we know by our best NCES data that Black schools, Black kids attend schools that measure lower than white schools on all 14 indicators that those studies, those longitudinal studies include. So if you're moving to one of those predominantly white schools or one with a higher white enrollment because you want the resource, yes, Ronnie, it is sad to say that you're likely to actually do less well there than you would at the Black school, predominantly Black school.
And that was the decision making I made for my child. I put her in a white school 1 year, and it was horrible. And we went back to the public school, local up the street. Fast forward, she graduated valedictorian in her class, but it was just night and day. It was night and it was no way. And her comparable friends who stayed where they were, it was different. It was wild to me because by every indicator, this was a better school, like better, whatever that meant. But it just didn't translate better for her. And I find that even when I taught in the math department at Morgan, now I teach graduate students, but I found students coming from these elite schools and I was teaching them and they were like, well, we didn't get this and we didn't do that. And I was like, what? You went where? They said, well, I wasn't in that track. And they would just say, oh, we was just over here. We were there, but we were over here. And math was the big divider. Wow.
I agree.
This makes my heart hurt, but okay. I could talk about this all day.
Well, were there any other, I know we're over by 5 minutes, so I mean, I'm ready to close, but just wanted to make sure that all voices and questions were given an opportunity. Anyone else? Okay, well, in that case, I want to thank you for the time we shared today, and just know that these slides will be uploaded, corrected with intersectionality example. I don't know how it was deleted, but I think it's important to include. And simultaneously, WTG, AQC cohort is doing the data science. What is data science session that will be uploaded, and we're going to at some point give each cohort different access or access, because we want you to have that information too, because there are a few sessions that you will not have together, and we want to give you access to as much as we can. So thank you again, and everyone enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.